My name is Harper Sloan. I'm 34 years old, and at 7:09 on a Friday night, while grilled butter hung thick in the air and cigarette smoke kept slipping in every time the bar door opened, my mother finally said the quiet part of this family out loud. We were on the enclosed back patio of a steakhouse in Nashville for Eden's engagement dinner, and folding chairs were scraping over brick while servers tried to squeeze past with silver trays and sweating glasses of wine. Melissa Sloan pointed me toward a cramped little side table shoved beside the service station, half set for two children and an extra place setting somebody had clearly added at the last minute, then looked me dead in the face and said, "You're good enough to help, not to be celebrated." She said it lightly, almost pleasantly, which made it worse. My father kept pretending to study the whiskey list. Eden laughed too quickly and reached for her fiancé's hand like this was all just one more family quirk everyone should find charming. I was still holding my phone from a work email I had answered in the parking lot, a trustee correspondence draft open on the screen, and three flagged reminders sitting under it because trust deadlines do not care about engagement dinners. That line should have humiliated me into silence. Instead, it clarified everything. I did not argue. I did not ask my mother whether the daughter who was good enough to help was also the same daughter she called whenever paperwork got ugly, accounts got tight, or some family emergency needed a woman who could think in sequence. I just stood there with the smell of charred steak and lemon polish in the back of my throat and understood that nothing about this was sudden. Eden got milestones. I got burdens. Eden got the room. I got the logistics. Eden got announced. I got assigned. For years, I had been the daughter who handled crises, fronted money quietly, corrected forms, absorbed panic, and kept the practical side of this family from sliding into disgrace while everyone else acted like visible love was something I could wait for. They did not think of me as a daughter to honor. They thought of me as a system to access. So I set my purse on that ridiculous little chair, smiled once because restraint is sharper than protest in rooms like that, and sat down where my mother had pointed. 5 days later, escrow called because the down payment Melissa had promised Eden was still trapped inside a housing trust that only moved if I signed it free. Before I tell you why my sister's dream house was never as secure as they all thought, tell me what time it is where you are and where you're watching from. I always want to know how far a story like this travels before it lands on someone who already knows what it feels like to be useful enough to build the table and still get seated away from it. Here's what they didn't understand when my mother pointed me toward that little children's table like she was doing simple seating management, instead of formalizing a hierarchy she had been living off for years. They thought they were humiliating the dependable daughter one more time, giving the celebrated daughter another visible milestone, and counting on me to keep the machinery underneath it all running because that is what I had always done. What they had actually done was build Eden's house story on top of a trust release they did not control. I work as a private client trust administrator, which means I do not hear the phrase family help the way most people do. I hear source, restriction, fiduciary duty, memo language, tax treatment, beneficiary intent, transfer timing, and every tiny loose sentence people use when they want money to move without the paperwork admitting what it really is. 3 years earlier, after my grandfather died and my mother started talking about the housing trust, like it was a soft little family cushion anyone emotional enough could dip into, I did the ugly, disciplined work nobody else wanted to touch. I restructured the trust's tax treatment. I protected it from earlier withdrawals Melissa had tried to characterize as temporary family support. I documented every request. I rebuilt the correspondence trail. I tightened the distribution memos. And because no one else in that family could be trusted not to treat controlled money like a feelings-based checking account, I ended up as the sole administrative trustee, not symbolic, not honorary, operational. Which meant the money my mother had been promising as Eden's house down payment did not legally move because Melissa smiled over brunch or because Eden got engaged in a room full of witnesses. It moved if I reviewed the distribution purpose, signed the release, and authorized the transfer. That distinction had annoyed my mother for years because structure always offends people who prefer access. By the next morning, after the engagement dinner, I was in my Nashville apartment with a mug of coffee cooling beside my laptop, pulling the trust instrument, the distribution restriction language, and the bank transfer controls into one clean folder because I already knew that Friday night had not been just a humiliation scene. It was a test. Not of my feelings, of whether they could still treat me like a function after saying the hierarchy plainly. I checked the trust first. Housing distributions required purpose review, timing review, and trustee authorization. I checked the bank controls next, still restricted exactly the way I had rebuilt them. I checked the last 6 months of archived correspondence after that, and there it was again in my mother's own writing, the family logic pretending to be urgency. Just handle it quietly. Don't make your sister jump through hoops. It's still family money. Family money. That phrase would have been funny if it had not financed so much entitlement already. It was never family money in the loose, emotional way Melissa meant it. It was protected money with a structure attached, and I was the structure. Around 10:22 that Saturday morning, I made the first professional move. I did not call my mother and ask whether she had already promised Eden a figure she had no authority to deliver. I did not send Eden some wounded sister message about respect and gratitude. I opened the trust file, flagged the pending request trail, and wrote one short internal memo to myself, documenting that no housing distribution approval had been executed. No release had been signed, and no representation by any family member should be treated as valid until trustee review was complete. Then I notified the bank relationship manager that any inquiry regarding imminent housing disbursement needed to be routed through me formally. No drama, no threat, just the end of assumption. The consequences started moving sooner than I expected. A lender information request hit the trust inbox Monday afternoon. A title company placeholder note arrived Tuesday asking about expected down payment timing. Then Wednesday evening, Eden posted a filtered photo of herself in front of a craftsman bungalow with the caption, "Our forever start." That was the first clue this was already bigger than one engagement dinner or one ugly sentence at a steakhouse. Contractors were being booked. A property story was being sold. A housing plan was already in motion around money they assumed would leave the trust because I had always been too controlled, too ashamed of conflict, and too used to carrying the practical burden to force the truth into daylight. Funny how often families call a woman mature when what they really mean is conveniently unlikely to interrupt them. The first panic call came 5 days after the engagement dinner at 8:41 a.m. While I was in my office in Nashville reviewing a trust accounting discrepancy for a widow whose 2 sons had somehow managed to misunderstand both beneficiary language and basic arithmetic in the same quarter. I had one monitor on a principal and income allocation sheet, one on a flag distribution queue, and one on the Sloan family problem I had been very carefully refusing to name as a crisis until somebody outside the family did it for me. The call came from a title company escrow officer named Marissa Bell, and the second I answered, I could hear the difference between a routine closing question and a file that had just found a live wire. "Ms. Sloan," she said, brisk but already strained, "we're trying to confirm timing on the down payment trust release tied to Eden Sloan's accepted offer. Contractors have been contacted, the lender is asking for proof of funds continuity, and we have no executed trustee approval on file. We were told you were handling the transfer." There it was. Not because my mother had suddenly developed a conscience, not because seating me beside the service station had bothered anyone after dessert, because escrow had finally reached the point in the chain where family performance stops counting as authority. I asked Marissa to send every request in writing and not to rely on any prior verbal representation about trust timing. Then I hung up, opened a clean note, and wrote the exact phrase that mattered most. Accepted offer without executed trustee release. By 8:56, the written request hit my inbox. Proof of trust distribution, signed release, transfer timing, lender continuity concern. It was not dramatic language. That was the problem. Real trouble in my line of work rarely arrives screaming. It arrives precise. At 9:03, Eden texted me for the first time since dinner. "OMG, Mom says escrow can't find your release. Did you forget to send it?" I let that one sit. At 9:11, my father called and left a voicemail in the tired, reasonable tone men use when they want coercion to sound like family leadership. Harper, be happy for your sister. Don't make everything about you right now. This house matters. At 9:18, my mother called. At 9:24, she called again. At 9:31, the family group chat, silent except for ring photos and paint swatches all week, suddenly lit up like a room where somebody had finally smelled smoke. Melissa wrote, "Harper, answer your sister." Eden followed with, "This is just paperwork, right?" Richard added, "We need to keep this moving before the sellers get nervous." There it was, exactly on schedule. Their promise, my duty. Their timing, my burden. Their fantasy, my release form. I still did not answer because that is one of the few advantages discipline gives you in a family like mine. It lets you decide whose emergency is real and whose is just overdue manipulation. At 9:42, while I was still clearing a balance discrepancy on the widow's file and documenting two corrected line items before I let myself re-enter the Sloan problem, Marissa Bell called again, this time with the lender's rep copied onto the follow-up email. The tone had changed already. Not because they suddenly cared about my role, because something had started falling apart in public-facing rooms. "Ms. Sloan," she said, "the family seems to believe funds are imminent, but we cannot continue speaking that way without formal trustee sign-off. The buyers have been acting as though the down payment is already secured." Acting as though. That phrase did more damage than any family accusation could have because it told me exactly where we were. My mother had not just promised Eden a house. She had already sold the certainty of it to other people. At 10:07, Eden's fiancé posted a contractor story from the front porch of the property with the caption, "Big things next month." At 10:19, my mother left the voicemail I knew was coming. She did not sound sad. She sounded annoyed that the daughter she had publicly reduced was still sitting inside the mechanism she needed. "Harper, call me back. The offer has been accepted, contractors are moving, and the sellers are expecting normal good faith timing. Don't make this ugly. Just release the funds, and we can sort out the rest later." There it was. Not, "Can we talk?" Not, "I'm sorry for Friday." Not even a half-decent lie ambitious enough to call itself misunderstanding. Just the command. Release it, save the scene, clean the family image after the fact. Not because they missed me, because the files still did. At 10:33, I finally answered Eden when she called again, mostly because I wanted her panic in her own voice before my mother rewrote it into something sweeter. She didn't say hello. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Mom said Grandpa always meant that money to help us get started." I looked at the trust instrument on my screen, at the distribution restrictions I had spent 3 years defending from exactly this kind of emotional freelancing, and said, "Your mother says a lot of things when she needs money to behave like love." She made a sharp little sound, half laugh and half outrage. "You are unbelievable. You'd really tank my house over technical control?" There was the family inversion in its natural form. A fiduciary gate reduced to my temperament. A trustee duty reduced to pettiness. "No," I said. "I'm refusing to rubber stamp a promise she had no authority to make." Then I ended the call before she could start crying or turn the whole thing into a morality play about sisters. By 11:02, Marissa Bell sent one more email, this time marked urgent, stating that unless the acting trustee signed the release, escrow would have to treat the down payment as unconfirmed and advise all parties accordingly. That was the outside escalation actor fully in the room now. Not mother, not sister, escrow, lender. Accepted offer, written chain. I typed one sentence back to my family after that, and only because I wanted the words where they could not deny them later. "No release has been approved." Then I put my phone face down and finished the widow's accounting file for a client who at least paid me to protect her money. What would you do when the same family that told you not to make everything about you only started panicking once escrow discovered you were the one holding the signature that made their promise real? The next morning, the problem changed categories. Up to that point, my mother still thought this was about whether I was being generous enough. Eden still thought it was about whether I could be emotionally pressured into doing what everyone had already promised on her behalf. And my father still believed the right blend of disappointment and family language could flatten the whole thing back into one more situation I would quietly handle because I always had. But at 8:12 a.m. on Thursday, the lender's rep sent a follow-up note through escrow, and the wording on that page made my whole body go cold in a way the engagement dinner had not. The issue was no longer being framed as a timing delay. It was now being framed as an unverified trust-funded down payment dependent on an unsigned fiduciary release. In plain English, that meant my mother had not just humiliated me at a restaurant and handed Eden a future she did not control. She had already let outside parties rely on a version of reality in which my authority either did not matter or could be assumed after the fact. That was when the story stopped being about a hurt daughter and became about misrepresentation, paper trail risk, and my name sitting inside a transfer chain I had never approved. I called Marissa Bell and asked the one question that mattered. Has anyone represented, directly or indirectly, that I agreed to release the trust funds and that this is merely an administrative lag? There was a pause on the line, then the careful answer professionals use when they know a room has already been polluted by family improvisation. Your mother described the release as routine and indicated you were simply busy, she said. The buyers have been speaking as though trustee approval was expected, not discretionary. Expected, not discretionary. There it was, the whole structure of my family in 6 words. My labor was expected, my caution was negotiable. My role existed only until the prettier daughter needed a milestone and my mother needed the check behind it. I thanked her, hung up, and opened a new folder on my desktop labeled exactly what the situation had become: Sloan Housing Trust, unauthorized distribution, assumption, full chain. Then I built the path the way I would build it for any client who needed the truth sharp enough to survive people's feelings. First, the trust instrument, highlighting the distribution language, the trustee powers, and the restriction clauses tied to housing support. Then the bank transfer restrictions I had drafted after Melissa's earlier temporary family borrowing episode 3 years ago. Then the trustee correspondence trail showing each prior family request, my written cautions, and the distinction I had kept trying to teach them between beneficiary hope and authorized release. Then the escrow requests, the lender follow-ups, and the distribution memos showing no release had ever been approved for Eden's house. After that came the archived emails from my mother, which read like a years-long attempt to disguise extraction as warmth. Handle it quietly. Don't humiliate your sister with formalities. You know what your grandfather wanted. After all we've done to keep this family afloat, the least you can do is make this easier. Easier. Another family word that only ever seemed to apply when they wanted my structure without my consent. Around 11:20, Melissa called from the house line, which meant she had given up on sounding wounded and was ready to sound managerial instead. I answered because by then I wanted her to say the thing she had been circling for years in language too blunt to defend later. This has gone far enough, she said. No hello, no Harper. The sellers are expecting continuity. Eden has already started coordinating contractors, and you are making your own sister look unstable over a technical release. There it was again. Technical release. As if fiduciary control were a mood, as if a housing trust could be converted into celebration money by maternal certainty alone. I looked at the trust memo on my screen and said, I'm not making her look anything. You promised a house before the trust authorized one. She took a sharp breath and came back harder. After all we've done to keep this family afloat, you owe your sister this start. Oh, there it was again. The family doctrine stated plain. Not trust, not gratitude, debt. I was 26 when I quietly advanced money to cover a tax issue my father had forgotten, while Eden got taken to Charleston for her birthday because she had been under so much stress. I was 29 when I spent a weekend restructuring the trust's tax treatment because Melissa had nearly turned it into a casual family reserve account, and my mother still called me difficult for insisting on memo language. I was 33 when Eden missed a lease deadline, Cried for 2 days, and somehow my inbox ended up full of paperwork because everyone agreed I was the one who knew how to calm the numbers down. Every visible milestone went to her. Every invisible burden rolled to me. Every time I protected the family, they called it maturity. Every time I named the structure, they called it selfishness. No, I told my mother. What you want is not family help. It's retroactive permission. She went silent for one beat too long, then said, "Don't embarrass us over something you can fix in 10 minutes." That line clarified the whole relationship better than any therapist ever could have. Not daughter, utility, not trust, access, not love. An administrative function they expected to turn on when summoned. I ended the call and sent one written instruction to Marissa Bell, the lender's rep, the bank relationship manager, and counsel. No party was to rely on any representation that the housing trust funds were approved, imminent, routine, or administratively delayed because no trustee release existed and no authority had been delegated. No speech, no fight, just the file corrected before their story could root itself deeper. Then Eden texted at 11:47. "Mom says you're doing this because you can't stand one day not being about you." I read it once and filed it, because by then I could finally name the thing without flinching. This was not family under pressure. It was access dressed up as intimacy, not support, control, not love, extraction with softer wording. Eden's champagne housewarming brunch started Sunday at 11:00 a.m., and I got there at 11:19 because timing matters when people have already committed to a lie and are still relaxed enough to keep speaking inside it. The property sat in a neat little row of renovated brick houses with fresh black shutters, a wide porch, and the kind of expensive staging that makes debt look like destiny. The front door was open. Laughter drifted out with the smell of citrus candles, butter pastries, and new paint. Someone had tied pale ribbon around the staircase banister. There were flutes lined up on the kitchen island. The interior designer was moving swatches around near the breakfast nook, and Eden was standing by the living room windows in white slacks and a soft cashmere set, like she had already survived the renovation phase of a life she did not yet legally occupy. My mother was beside her, smiling in that composed, benevolent way she uses when she wants a room to experience her as the architect of family happiness, instead of the person who keeps building it out of other people's labor. My father stood near the porch with Eden's future in-laws, nodding too much. The listing agent was in the dining area, still professionally bright. A lender's rep I recognized from the escrow chain had just stepped in through the hallway with a leather folio tucked under one arm and the careful face of a man who knew something. Administrative had gone bad and was hoping social theater might still contain it. Good. That was exactly the room my mother had chosen, and exactly the room she deserved. She saw me first and the smile faltered just briefly before she forced it back into place. "Harper," she said, crossing the room with a flute in her hand, voice low enough to try to keep it private. "Don't do this today." I looked past her at the ribbon on the staircase, the pastries, the design boards, the people already photographing themselves in a house Eden did not yet have the money to close on, and then back at my mother. "You already did it Friday," I said. "You just chose nicer furniture for it this time." That landed. Her mouth tightened. Eden turned next, all bright indignation. "Why are you here if you're going to act like this?" she asked, loud enough for the designer and one of Brent's cousins to hear. There was my public invitation. "Because this housewarming is happening inside a funding story that still needs my signature," I said. Conversations around us thinned, not into silence at first, but into the kind of listening people do when they are trying to look normal, while instinct tells them something important is cracking. My mother stepped closer and used the voice she saves for moments when she wants control to sound like grace. "Be happy for your sister," she said. "This is not the time to make everything about you." There it was, the family script in its purest form, their promise, my selfishness, their use of my authority, my ego, their public performance, my bad timing. I set my folder on the island beside the champagne and opened it without hurry. The lender's rep stopped moving. The listing agent looked from me to Melissa and understood exactly enough to stay quiet. I laid out 3 pages first, the trust instrument with the distribution restriction highlighted, the escrow request showing the missing trustee release, the memo confirming no disbursement had been approved. Then I looked at the lender's rep, not my mother, because professionals are usually the first honest people left in rooms like that. Before anyone here keeps speaking as if this property is already funded, I said, you should know the down payment trust release has never been authorized. Eden gave a short laugh that broke in the middle. Oh my God, Harper, are you seriously doing this in front of people? I did not look at her yet. I looked at the lender's rep and asked, can you confirm whether escrow currently has a signed trustee release for the promised down payment? He shifted his folio in his hands, glanced once at my documents, then gave the only answer left available to him. No, he said, we do not. There. One sentence. One clean, professional no. The room changed immediately, not emotionally, structurally. The listing agent's smile disappeared. The interior designer took 2 steps back from the kitchen samples. One of Eden's future in-laws set down her champagne glass without drinking from it. My mother reached for the papers and I moved them out of her hand before she touched them. No, I said, just that. Short, cold, enough. Eden flushed hard. This is administrative, she snapped. Mom told us you were just being slow. I finally looked at her then. Your mother sold you certainty she did not own, I said. That is not the same thing as a delay. My father tried to recover the room the way men like him always do, with tone instead of truth. Harper, he said, there's no reason to embarrass your sister in front of guests. You already embarrassed me in front of guests, I said. I'm just the first one here willing to let the file speak. That one traveled. I could feel it move through the room because everybody there knew, even if only vaguely, that there had been an engagement dinner, that families choose favorites in small ways long before they do it in large ones, and that I had just answered a much older insult with a much newer piece of paper. My mother tried one last minimization. We're family, this was always going to be handled. Yes, I said. By me, quietly, after you promised it publicly. The lender's rep cleared his throat and said, with the polite finality of someone closing a gate, that until the acting trustee executed the release, the down payment had to be treated as unconfirmed, and the closing timeline could not be represented as secure. The listing agent's face fell in the exact professional way I had expected. She was already calculating how much of the staging story now had to be rolled back. Eden's voice cracked on the next line. So what, you want me to lose the house? I closed the folder. No, I said, I want you to stop calling assumption ownership. That was the needle line, and it hit because even my mother went quiet for one full beat. Then the room belonged to nobody in my family anymore. It belonged to escrow, to the lender, to the file, to the people who had just realized they were standing inside a celebration built on money that had never actually been released. I picked up my folder and stepped back from the island before the moment could slide into crying and false softness. At the front door, my mother called after me in the voice she uses when history is supposed to reverse itself for her comfort. Harper, please don't ruin this. I turned once. I'm not ruining it, I said. I'm refusing to fund your lie. Then I walked out into the Tennessee winter sun while the brunch kept going behind me without certainty, which is a much smaller event than the one they had staged. Tell me honestly, when a family builds a milestone on top of your silence and your signature, is exposing the truth revenge or just the first honest thing anyone has done for the house? Public embarrassment did not heal me. It did not send me home glowing with justice, and it did not make the brunch feel noble just because the lender's rep had finally said out loud what my mother had been trying to skate past for days. It made me feel wired, nauseated, and so awake that at 2:18 a.m., Monday morning, I was standing barefoot in my kitchen, staring at the blue light on my coffee maker, like it had personally offended me. That is the part stories like this usually lie about. They pretend that once the truth enters the room, the body catches up and thanks you for it. Mine didn't. Mine still knew the old job: absorb the hit, calm the room, translate the damage into something survivable for everybody else. By sunrise, the tactics had already changed the way they always change when guilt stops working and panic takes over. My mother sent a long text saying Eden had not stopped crying, that the sellers were concerned, that Richard's blood pressure was up, and that I had turned one administrative delay into a family humiliation campaign. My father left 2 voicemails asking me whether being right was worth torching your sister's start. Eden wrote 4 paragraphs about sisterhood, shame, and how I had made her look unstable in front of her future in-laws over a technicality. There it was again. Technicality, a trust release reduced to mood, a fiduciary gate reduced to my personality, a legal authority chain reduced to whether I was being generous enough to erase myself on schedule. What bothered me most was not their wording. It was the ugly little piece of me that still wanted somebody to tell me I was allowed to stop. Allowed to stop fronting competence. Allowed to stop being the quiet daughter who made deadlines hold and wires land, and family promises look less fraudulent than they were. So instead of calling any of them back, I took the whole thing to therapy, because by then I understood that if I did not drag the pattern somewhere honest, I would eventually mistake my own exhaustion for mercy and do what they had always counted on. Dr. Lena Markham's office overlooked a parking lot and a line of winter trees, and she asked me to start where I wanted. I started, like I always do, with sequence instead of pain. The dinner, the kids' table, the line my mother used, the trust, the escrow call, the brunch. The way my mother kept treating authority like a vibe that could be softened if everybody wore nicer clothes. Then Dr. Markham asked the one question that cut through the whole structure. When did your family first teach you that competence was the price of your seat? I sat there for a long time, because the answer was so old it felt built into my bones. I was 13 when my mother started routing bank forms through me because I was better with details, while Eden got taken shopping because she had better taste. I was 24 when my father called me from a hospital parking lot to untangle one of his tax notices and then forgot to mention at dinner that I had saved him from penalties. I was 31 when I spent 6 months restructuring the housing trust after Melissa's earlier withdrawal mess, and still got told I was lucky to be useful to the family. Dr. Markham did not tell me to forgive them. She asked the better question. How long have you been confusing invisibility with maturity? That question stayed in my body all day. I went home, opened a yellow legal pad, and wrote the pattern the way I would write any client chronology that needed to survive scrutiny: visible daughter, useful daughter, celebrated daughter, corrective daughter. Eden got milestones. I got infrastructure. Eden got reassurance. I got assignment. Once I saw it in sequence, the guilt lost some of its holiness. It started looking less like love and more like conditioning. Then came the meeting. My father texted Tuesday and said we needed one adult conversation before this gets beyond repair. That phrase almost made me laugh because in my family, adult conversation usually means please accept the burden without making us name the terms. I agreed only because I wanted the terms named this time. We met Wednesday afternoon in the conference room at the trust attorney's office, not at my parents' house, not at a restaurant, not anywhere my mother could rearrange the furniture and call it reconciliation. The room smelled faintly like toner and stale coffee. My mother sat first and went immediately for revision. She said the dinner line had been badly timed, that the house had become emotionally loaded, that Eden never meant to assume anything. My father said everyone had been moving fast. Eden said she had trusted what she was told. Then I put the documents on the table one by one. Trust instrument, restriction clauses, distribution memo history, escrow request, release status. My mother's handle it quietly emails, the brunch timing, the accepted offer dates. The room changed. Facts do that. They pull all the warm ambiguity manipulative people like to live inside and strip it down to sequence. My mother snapped first. You always need paper to feel powerful. No, I said. I need paper when people around me keep trying to spend what they do not control. My father went to the older script after that. You are making this bigger than it has to be. No, I told him. You made it public before it was real. Eden finally said the true thing by accident. You could have just signed it and let me have one good thing. There it was. Not entitlement hidden behind family. Entitlement spoken plainly enough to stop pretending. I felt something inside me go still then, not broken, not dramatic, just finished. I am not releasing trust funds because mom promised them too early, I said. I am not rewriting the file to protect your image. I am not handling property, trust, or money requests off the record anymore. And I am done being the family toolkit you open only when something expensive starts slipping. My mother called that cruel. My father said I would regret making everything final. Eden started crying in the breathless, angry way she has always cried when consequences refused to reorganize themselves around her comfort. I stood up anyway, not after closing, not after everybody calmed down. Done. Then I took my folder and left them in the room with the first accurate version of me they had been forced to hear. The fallout took a little over 6 weeks, and the reason it landed so hard was that it moved through the boring places first. Not the emotional places, not the places my mother could still try to soften with tears, lowered voices, or one more appeal to family unity. It moved through escrow, underwriting, property deadlines, and the kind of written clarification that makes performance useless. The sellers granted one short extension, then another, but by the second week, the listing agent had stopped speaking in cheerful future tense and started using words like unverified funds, contingency exposure, and reputational concern. The lender's rep, who had been polite enough to let my family save face at the brunch, became much more precise in writing. No trustee release meant no clean proof of funds. No clean proof of funds meant no reliable closing sequence. No reliable closing sequence meant Eden's forever start was now just a social media caption sitting on top of a file with a hole in it. That is the thing about houses. They are less sentimental than people want them to be. They care about cleared money, signed authority, and dates. The house did not care that my mother loved the breakfast nook, or that Eden had already chosen paint samples. By the third week, the contractors who had been casually booked in advance began asking whether their start windows were real. The interior designer quietly backed out of holding custom pieces without a funded close. One of the future in-laws, who had been all enthusiasm and Prosecco at the brunch, suddenly had very little to say in the group chat once it became clear that the down payment was not delayed by weather or banking volume or some polite little clerical lag. It was delayed because the only person with authority to move it had never agreed. My mother tried to reroute the shame the way she always did. First, she said the market was chaotic. Then she said the lender had become unusually rigid. Then she called me and said, "You are forcing strangers to think poorly of this family." I let that one go to voicemail. Strangers were not thinking poorly of the family because I had refused to disappear. They were thinking poorly of the family because my mother had promised a transfer before the trust had ever approved it. By week 4, the accepted offer was gone. Not in a dramatic, everybody out on the sidewalk way, just gone the way real opportunities go when paperwork never catches up to confidence. The sellers moved on to a backup buyer with cleaner funding. Eden's housewarming photos turned into one more set of images with no legal future under them. My father left me a voicemail that sounded older than I had ever heard him. "We were trying to help your sister get started," he said. "You didn't have to let it go this far." That line almost made me laugh because it still treated the collapse like something I had allowed instead of something they had built. I did not rescue the whole family, but I did one narrow ethical thing because I refused to confuse boundaries with collateral cruelty. Through counsel, I approved a formal trust memorandum clarifying the housing guidelines for any future eligible request, not for Eden's benefit, not as a second chance, but to protect the instrument itself from one more round of family improvisation. Clean criteria, documented process, no verbal assumptions, no maternal promises, no implied urgency because someone had already fallen in love with a staircase. After that, I became unavailable for distortion in the only way that matters. Written only. Every money request redirected, every voicemail saved, every "can we just talk family to family" ignored unless it came through counsel and named the actual issue. About a month after the brunch, the trust attorney requested a formal declaration for the file confirming the distribution had never been approved, the release had never been signed, and any representation to the contrary had been made without trustee authority. I reviewed it, corrected 2 phrases, and signed it the same afternoon. No embellishment, no revenge paragraph, no daughterly grief hidden inside the memo, just a clean record. That was more devastating than any speech I could have made at the steakhouse or the brunch, because once the facts were fixed in the trust file, escrow correspondence, and distribution history, my family could no longer narrate me into the role of jealous sister instead of administrative gatekeeper. Facts are colder than emotion, but they age better. Once they settle into the record, they stop caring who the favorite was. A month later, my mother asked to meet, and I almost refused because by then I understood something I had spent most of my adult life trying not to understand. Closure is not the same thing as restored access, and access is not the same thing as love. Still, I agreed to one final meeting because I wanted the truth stated in a room where nobody could soften it back into family weather. We met in a conference room at the trust attorney's office on a Tuesday at 4:44 p.m., late light flattening against the glass, burnt coffee going untouched on the side credenza, and the kind of dry office heat that makes everyone look a little more tired than they intended. My mother arrived first in one of her soft cashmere wraps, as if texture could still do moral work for her. My father came in next with the defeated posture of a man who had finally discovered that passivity has a cost if you keep paying it in daughters. Eden showed up last, quieter than I had ever seen her, which was the first honest thing about her in months. My mother opened the meeting the way women like her always do when consequence finally gets through the silk and the language, not with apology, with pain. "This has been devastating for the family," she said. There it was, the old trick. Make damage sound communal so nobody has to name where it began. I let the silence sit there long enough to turn useful. Then I said the cleanest version of the truth I had. "You promised my sister a house with money you did not control, then expected me to sign away the reality after you had already sold the fantasy." My mother's eyes filled after that, maybe with real tears, but tears are weather, not proof, and I had spent too many years confusing visible emotion with moral change. My father tried next, because men like him always come in after the first softness fails. "We were trying to help Eden get started," he said. "That's all this ever was." I looked at him and felt nothing but accuracy. "No," I said, "that's what you told yourselves. What it actually was another plan built on the assumption that I would absorb the risk and keep quiet about it." Eden finally spoke then, and the worst part was that her voice sounded young, not innocent, just underdeveloped. "I didn't know Mom didn't have it secured," she said. "I thought you'd sign because we're family." There it was, the whole structure in one sentence. Not because she had earned it, not because the trust supported it cleanly, because we're family. Which in my house had always meant Harper will fix the uncomfortable part off stage. My mother asked the fantasy question after that, the one families like mine always ask once the useful daughter is still physically present but no longer psychologically available to disappear on cue. "Is there any way to move past this?" she said. That line might once have worked on me because I used to translate vague emotional requests into labor. A call, a transfer, a memo, a fix, a softened consequence. But by then I knew the difference between being needed and being loved, and they are not interchangeable no matter how many mothers cry when the bill arrives. "You can move past it," I said. "You just can't do it through me the way you used to." My father asked if that meant everything now had to go through lawyers. Trusts, money, property, estate requests, emergency wiring, off-record paperwork. "Yes," I said. "For the rest of it, maybe one day, if behavior changes before the language does." My mother flinched at that because she had spent years mistaking the right words for changed behavior. Then she said the line I think she believed would still unlock me. "After all I've done to hold this family together." I stopped her, not loudly, just clearly. "You held it together by deciding who got softness and who got duty." That was the line that ended the meeting, even though nobody stood up right away, because it was true enough to make every other sentence in the room feel decorative. Eden looked down. My father stared at the table. My mother cried harder. None of it moved me the way it once would have, not because I had become cruel, but because I had finally stopped mistaking my own availability for virtue. Love without respect is just control wearing softer clothes, and I was done dressing it back up for them. The practical ending came next, which is the only kind I trust. In June, I closed on a loft condo in my own name in a converted warehouse just east of downtown Nashville. Brick walls, steel windows, one long room with enough quiet in it that no one else's emergency could pretend to belong there. I signed the papers alone and felt calmer than I had at any family milestone in years. Around the same time, I filed the internal paperwork that ended my last informal family-facing role in the trust ecosystem. No more just review this. No more can you look at one thing. No more calls disguised as updates that were really attempts to reopen access. Then my attorney sent the final notice. Clean, narrow, non-negotiable. No trust, money, or property request from any Sloan family member would ever again be handled off the record, outside formal documentation, or on the assumption of personal cooperation. I approved it without changing a word. That was the deeper revenge. Not that Eden lost the house, not that my mother had to sit inside the embarrassment of a brunch built on money she did not control, not even that my father finally had to look at the cost of always letting the practical daughter go last. The deeper revenge was that I was no longer available for the role they had written for me. I was not the emergency drawer they could keep opening. I was not the quiet daughter who turned recklessness into continuity. I was not the system they got to use while seating me away from the celebration. They did not miss the daughter, they missed the function. Too many families call that love because admitting the difference would force them to look at what they built. So tell me honestly, if your family only valued your steadiness when there was money, paper, or property at risk, would you ever let them back in once you finally locked the file? And what would have been your breaking point, the kids' table, the frozen escrow, the fake housewarming, or the moment you realized they never meant family in a way that included your dignity?